With Bloomburrow spoilers having officially wrapped up, we can jump into the full set review for all of the cards available to us from Bloomburrow, which releases on August 2nd. My name is Nathan, this is the Salty Productions YouTube channel. We're going to be starting with white, and I'm going to make a 5-video series going in WUBRG order. Red will have colorless and lands in it, so stay tuned for that. But we are going to look at all of the mythics, rares, uncommons, and commons for playability in Commander. And the reason for that is that sometimes you find some diamonds in the rough with the uncommons and commons that just perform sort of the vegetable role of certain deck archetypes. Like Winding Way, for example, is a common that I love in self-mill decks that you would never know just by reviewing only the rares and mythics. And one last word before we jump into this. If you like this video, please leave a like on it and subscribe. It helps me with the algorithm and shows me that you enjoy set reviews like this one. All right, let's jump into it. First, we have Caretaker's Talent, which is a 3-mana class enchantment. Whenever one or more tokens you control enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. We can pay 1, level it up to level 2, and this class becomes level 2. Create a token that's a copy of target token you control, and we can pay 4 to give our tokens +2/+2. Now, the immediate comparison, I think, for this card is in a token deck that wants to be drawing cards. So Idol of Oblivion is a classic staple in token decks, and you have sort of a 3 blind mice comparison too, I think, because you have the second mode where we can create a copy of a target token we control. So I think that this deck is definitely a slam dunk in any token deck. I think it's probably the 3rd or 4th best option. You have your like Welcoming Vampires, Mentor of the Meek I think has been pushed out, but I think like Takesha's Welcome would also be a good comparable here. And so for 3 mana to essentially draw a card once a turn as essentially a semi-restricted Phyrexian Arena, I think that this is definitely playable in your token decks, and you can even in the late game it's very modal because you can then pay if you are keeping it at the level 1 for most of the game. We can pay then 5 mana to give our tokens that buff, which I think is definitely playable, and then it even can see some play I think in populate decks just because it gives you that 1 mana create a token that's a copy of target token you control. So any of your Gared decks that want to be creating copies of big token bodies, I think this definitely goes in there as well. So Caretaker's Talent, I think, will probably be the top 3rd or 4th option for card draw options in token decks, perhaps nudging out even Welcoming Vampire just because it has the modality to give ourselves that token buff, which token decks want very much. Next, we have Drewdrop Cure. 3-mana sorcery. We can gift a card to an opponent, return up to 2 target creature cards, each with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the gift was promised, instead return up to 3 target creature cards, each with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, I think this is a pretty slam dunk in self-mill decks that happen to run a lot of low-cost creatures. I think this will probably see play in a lot of Orzhov decks with a lot of tiny guys, such as your Stitcher Supplier, your undead butlers that want to be milling, and so once those get sacrificed to perhaps a sack outlet or something like that, we can bring them back with Drewdrop Cure. I think that even if you play an Esper Sentinel turn 1 and it gets removed right away, you can bring that back as well. So there's some good stuff options in white, like your Night of Lloyd Orchids, that can possibly be brought back with Drewdrop Cure, but you definitely want to be in a self-mill deck. I do think that gifting a card is not a big downside just because you can control where that card goes. I think with the gifting mechanic overall, we're going to see more cards being given in games, but I don't think you want a critical mass of gifting effects because to be giving out too many cards is probably spelling trouble for you. So I think that if you run 1 or 2 gift a card type of effects, that's totally fine. And I think that because you can control where the gift goes, you can give it to the lowest board state player to help them out a little bit, and you can also curry favor with this as well. So I think there's a little bit of upside with the politics you can run with Drewdrop Cure, and this can bring back a lot of staples that we can see in white or any sort of self-mill type of decks. So what commanders would this be running? I think you would be running this in like a Raffine deck where you are just again, conniving X, where you're running a lot of little creatures to get that connive value up. And then it could maybe see play in a Caretaker deck as well, which is basically turbo self-mill. I have a Caretaker deck myself, and I've been considering this for that. But it really depends on your creature loadout, I believe. If you're running a lot of 3 and 4 drops, then this would probably be edged out and not make the cut. But it certainly has potential by bringing back 3 creatures, which I don't know that we've necessarily seen on a 3-drop like this before. Next we have Harvestrite Host, 3 mana 3/3 rabbit citizen. When it or another rabbit you control enters, a target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. That is not a big deal. I think what you really play this for is this next part. Then draw a card if this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn. So I think this fits pretty much into your rabbit decks. Rabbits want to be going wide. That's one of their main focuses in the set. So your Kadira Caller of the small decks are eating pretty well with the set, given the amount of rabbit support. And I think Quain you could possibly also run as a rabbit commander as well, although I think he tends to be more of an Azorius control commander. But I think that this is yet another sort of 3 mana draw 3 cards once a turn type of effects. And I think you would only want this if you care about the rabbit creature type, which is why it makes it into the list. Then we have Hop to It, which is a 3 mana create 3 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. So once again, it fits into your rabbit token decks, but honestly, I think this makes the cut in your high powered token decks like Jetmir Nexus of Revels. I also have a Jetmir deck built out, and honestly, the deck really just wants efficient 1-for-1 token creation for each mana. So I would happily play a 3 mana create 3 tokens in Jetmir. I'd rather actually jam a 3 mana create 3 tokens than a 2 mana create 2 tokens, just because you want to be utilizing as much of that token creation as you can. And I think it's just better to jam another token within that card's worth of value, if that makes sense. So I think that this is just a great option. It's just a great vanilla option for these token go-wide decks. And so, yeah, I don't think there's much to say, just because the card is very simple and very clean, which I do also appreciate in this design. Next, we have Parting Gust. 2 mana instant, you can gift a tapped 1/1 to an opponent. Exile target non-token creature if the gift wasn't promised. Return that creature to the battlefield under its owner's control with a 1/1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is a modal instant that is a removal spell, but also a blink spell. And so this naturally fits into blink decks, I believe. The thing with Brago in particular, Brago is a pretty high power blink deck, and I don't know that you would necessarily want this in Brago because there's a lot of options that blink all of your creatures at once, but it's the modal part that I think really takes us over the top, where if you already have your blink spells on the field, you have your Brago on the field, you know it's not going to be removed, then you can use this as essentially a generous gift or a Swords to Plowshares, which I think is pretty good. And if you care about the 1/1 counters, it gets even better, although I don't think there are a lot of blink decks that specifically care about 1/1 counters, but I was just looking at EDH deck, and I think Genku Future Shaper might care a little bit about the 1/1 counters. With its ability, you can sort of abuse that with some extra proliferate effects in your deck, but this is an interesting card. I think it probably would make the cut in a Brago deck, just because you are always looking to either have offense or defense, and the blink is great on offense and can also serve as a protection spell, or you can just use it as a removal spell. And so I think that's pretty great, and this one might easily go missed in the uncommons, but I think it is definitely worth mentioning on our playables list. Next we have Season of the Burrow, 5 mana sorcery mythic. Choose up to 5 widgets worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. We can pay 1 to create a 1/1 token, pay 2 to exile target online permanent its controller draws a card, or pay 3 to return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. So this is essentially an increasing devotion with the option to have a Savine's Reclamation. The exile mode is great as well, and I think that most of the time this is probably going to be appearing in token decks, most of the time as a 5 mana create 5 1/1s. However, I think the ability to create 3 1/1s and then also exile something and have its controller draw a card is going to be perfectly playable as well. I was trying to think of what would be a great scenario for the reanimation strategy. I just don't think because it's worth 3 widgets here, I don't think that this is the most powerful of the abilities. However, if you have a very powerful 3-drop that you really want to stick around on the board, I think that it has some value there. The indestructible counter I don't think really matters too much. It could be a great blocker for combat, but indestructible in 2024 I just don't think is worth very much given the prevalence of Source to Plowshares, Path to Exile, all of these board wipes, Farewell, Toxic Deluge that get around indestructible. So if you look at the third mode here as essentially 3 mana and reanimate a 3-drop from your graveyard with an indestructible counter on it, I just don't think it's really worth the mana here. So I think most of the time this is going to be played in tokens, and so I think it goes great into like your Jetmir type of decks as well. Next we have Starfall Invocation, which is a 5-mana sorcery. We can gift a card, destroy all creatures. If the gift was promised, return a creature card put into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. When I watched the Nitpicking Nerds set review for this card, they were a little bit lower on it because it's a 5-mana Wrath. However, I think the reanimation component of this spell really takes it up and over the top, and I am extremely high on this card. The reason is, when you look at the top cards in the format, right, what is the most played mono white board wipe? Vanquish the Horde, which most of the time costs only 2 mana, and so when you play your board wipe for 2, the benefit is that you are the first to rebuild by casting something else from your hand. Well, this essentially is Vanquish the Horde plus that other card. If we give the gift, we can then reanimate the next card that we would, or not the next card that we would play from our hand, but rather from our graveyard, we would be rebuilding from our graveyard. And so I think that this card is actually better than Vanquish the Horde, if I'm being completely honest, because I would happily pay 5 mana to then be the first person to have some sort of valuable creature on the board. And in a way, it is better than Vanquish the Horde because it combines those 2 cards into one to have more sort of card value, which you can kind of construe as card advantage, but it just essentially combines both of those effects of having the cheap board wipe and then rebuilding into one card, which I think is super good. And some all-stars that you might be reanimating, I mean, like Kakusha the Evening Star, right? If you want these death triggers, I think that this is great. And you know, the dream I think would be to then have Kakusha return, and then you immediately sack it again to have each of your opponents lose 10 life, and you effectively gain 30 life, which is pretty great. Or you could be playing like your mono white all-star Elish Norn to bring back just a giant creature that then oppresses other creatures from entering. So Starfall Invocation I am extremely high on, and I think that this will definitely edge out a lot of board wipes in my decks, and it might even edge out Farewell, although Farewell kind of sits in a category all on its own. But I think that it's like Farewell is like your number 1, and then this might even be number 2, and then like Vanquish the Horde is after that. So definitely high on Starfall Invocation. Next we have Warren, a Warleader, 4-mana Rabbit Knight, 4/4 with Offspring for 2 colorless. Whenever you attack, choose one, create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token that's tapped and attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is a Rabbit and a Knight card, and I think this goes great in your Rabbit and Knight decks, so your Kadira Caller of the Small, of course, but it also fits into Ishin decks because of that attack trigger. I think if you cast this for 6 mana, so you would have the 1/1 copy, you would get both attack triggers that then get doubled. So then, you know, the Magical Christmas Land would be essentially you play this for 6, next turn you swing with Ishin on the board, giving your attacking creatures +4/+4, which is pretty great, I must say. I think that, you know, if you can make use of the rabbit creature tokens, that's even better, and it itself is a rabbit, so I think it definitely fits into your rabbit decks, and I will certainly be slotting this into my Jabbar Knight decks as well, just because Knights are lacking for really powerful mythics, and so this will definitely make the cut in Knight Tribal. Next we have Murmuration, which is a 5-mana enchantment. Birds you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, for each spell you've cast this turn, create a 1/2 creature token named Stormcrow. So this is very easily a slot in for your bird tribal decks, and I think specifically you have to have a lot of low-cost creatures that you are spamming onto the field with effects like Vanquisher's Banner to then refill your hand, so like a Kongi Sky Warden, which is bird tribal. And And I was also thinking, does this have a home in Spellslinger decks? So I have like Caretaker Wind's Fury, which is kind of a Jeskai Spellslinger type of build. Also itself a bird, if in case you care about birds. And so I was thinking that this is pretty awkward in Spellslingers because it is an enchantment. It's not an instance or sorcery. So you really want payoffs for going wide in your Spellslinger deck if you happen to have a deck like that. The problem is that typically with Spellslinger, when you are going off and sling a bunch of spells, you either have typically like burn payoffs or any sort of snowbally effects like a Mizzix's Mastery or something where you're overloading all of these spells. And so as an enchantment that just makes tokens, I'm trying to think if this really makes the cut, and I'm not sure that it would. I think you specifically have to care about either birds or going wide in your Spellslinger deck. So something like a Caretaker Wind's Fury I think would maybe be the only home for this card, but it definitely is good in your bird tribal decks and is a consideration there. Next, we have Perch Protection. 6 mana instant, you can gift an extra turn. Create 4 2/2 blue bird creature tokens with flying. If the gift was promised, all permanents you control phase out, and until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything, and you exile it so you can't loop it. Now, the obvious comparable here is Teferi's Protection. So this is a quote-unquote fixed version of Teferi's Protection, and also sort of your clever concealment type of ilk of cards. I am interested in testing this, and I don't know if it will be good because the extra turn being gifted, I think, is sort of the crux of whether this card is good or bad. If you give an extra turn to your opponent, this can certainly make somebody else the arch enemy, and so I was thinking like, maybe you take a lot of heat off of yourself as the arch enemy, and by giving somebody else an extra turn, they take some of the attention at the table off from you. Or alternatively, I was thinking maybe you could give the extra turn to the person who is behind the most so that they can essentially make the least use of it, quote unquote. I mean, an extra turn is obviously very powerful. So that's sort of the positive aspects of the card, but the extra turn itself, if you think about sort of your standard extra turn spells, they're about 5 mana. So you are essentially giving out 5 mana worth of spells. So if you add on that 5 mana to the cost of this is essentially an 11 mana Teferi's Protection, if we sort of look at it like that. And so that is not playable. If you care about birds, I think this probably would be a lot better because you have a lot more payoffs for those tokens. And I will say that this definitely gives you the creatures to be able to swing out with an Alpha Strike for next turn once you phase back in. So I think, does this take the... So like Teferi's Protection, I think, still remains at the top, right? Goes into any white deck. You can always make use of this. It's just the best fog in the game. Does it edge out Clever Concealment? I don't think so, because Clever Concealment can be cast for free, potentially. This is a true 6 mana protection spell, and so you have to hold up 6 mana. So if you don't use the spell, I think you also have to be able to make use of that mana, because 6 mana is a ton to hold up. So I'm kind of leaning on the side of this being probably unplayable, but because it has the Teferi's Protect, I am hesitant to make that conclusion fully. So I'm really interested in testing out this card. And if you guys have played with this card, maybe in your pre-release or something like that, or maybe you have some early access, leave a comment down below with your experience. I'd be very interested in hearing if this card is good or not. It's very hard to evaluate just because it depends on how you use that extra turn. But on the flip side, it is one of the best spells in the game, and but the problem is it costs 6. So like, you've got so many factors tugging on whether this card is good or bad. So I think that this is definitely one of the cards I want to test most from Bloomburrow. Next, we have the honorable mentions. So the cards that didn't quite make the cut for being playable in Commander, but I just wanted to mention in case that they are fitting into a specific deck that you might have. Beza, the Bounding Spring, 4 mana, 4/5 elemental elk. When it enters, create a treasure. If an opponent controls more lands than you, you gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you, or create 2/1/1 fish tokens. If an opponent controls more creatures than you, draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. So this, I think, is most comparable to Sunset Revelry, and I think in particular you have to care about the token making aspect of this card, because if we look at the other modes, so if we create a treasure token, this is essentially a 3 mana 4/5 with the rest of these abilities. Yes, it has a good body, but good bodies we know in Commander are not enough to carry this card to making the cut. So if we look at the treasure token, okay, if we get the treasure token, we probably can get that, because if we're in white and we're not in green, we probably have somebody that is ramping more than us. So the 4 life we probably don't really care about. That's not going to generate a lot of advantage on board to allow us to snowball. The creature tokens we want to be able to care about, and then draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you, which we'll probably be able to do as well. So let's say even if we get the treasure token and the draw a card mode, what this is 3 mana, 4/5 that cantrips. Is that playable in Commander? Not particularly, I don't think. Even if we tack on the 4 life, that's doesn't really put this over the edge. What you want to do is care about the tokens in a token style deck that you can use to Alpha Strike or Overrun. I just don't think a 3 mana 4/5 that cantrips is not playable, or is not playable in your normal sort of 7-level power decks. You want to have the tokens that you can use for something later, and those are, I think, where you really get the mana value out of this card. So that's why this appears on the honorable mentions list. I just don't think it's really playable in most decks unless you care about making 3 bodies for essentially 3 mana. Next we have Dawn's Truce, which is a 2 mana instant. We can gift a card. You and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. If the gift was also promised, permanents you control also getting indestructible until end of turn. So the obvious comparison here is Heroic Intervention. Personally, I don't really play Heroic Intervention unless I have a commander that I really care about staying on the board, and even then, I feel like Heroic Intervention is one of those cards where I'd rather have a card in hand that can help to rebuild, because it does not defend against the Toxic Deluges and Farewells of the world, or the, well, I guess it does defend against targeted removal, but it really doesn't defend against like the Sunfalls. And so I don't run a lot of Heroic Intervention because I feel like it's one of those cards that secretly rots in players' hands instead of having another option to rebuild. Once that board wipe will hit, would I rather have a 2 mana card that I can rebuild or a 2 mana protection spell? They're kind of the same, and so I'd rather have more of the ability to always build rather than have a niche scenario for saving my stuff. And so Dawn's Truce is just a worse version of Heroic Intervention, so it wouldn't make the cut in my particular decks in white, but I think that it is definitely an option, and the first option that is like Heroic Intervention that we've gotten in white. There is, I think, Everybody Lives, but I don't think that gives your stuff indestructible. So anyway, Dawn's Truce, if you want to play this, I think it is definitely playable if you want to be protecting your board against destroy type of effects. Next, we have Jackdaw Savior, 3 mana, 3/1 bird cleric with flying. Whenever it or another creature you control flying dies, return another target creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is very much like Luminous Broodmoth, kind of, sort of, but that says whenever creature you control without flying dies. So Jackdaw Savior, probably mostly playable in bird decks or any sort of reanimation deck that has a flying sub-theme. I think that the reanimation ability is pretty great, and you can probably generate a lot of value if you have like a Phyrexian Arena or something like that, where you have a bunch of your, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 mana flyers on board. You can sack all of them, and then if they have either leave the battlefield or enters the battlefield triggers, you can get value there. But I just don't think that this would see play in a generic white deck, which is why this is on the honorable mentions list. But Jackdaw Savior, interesting for bird tribal. Alright, next we have Nettle Guard, which is a 2-mana mouse soldier common. It's a 3/1. I'm going to skip the Valiant ability because we don't really care about that, but we can pay 1 and sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. This is most comparable to Cathar Commando, and I just wanted to mention this in case you are looking for a soldier that can destroy target artifact or enchantment. If you're already playing a Cathar Commando in your soldier tribal deck, this is another option. Next we have Shrike Force, 3-mana 1/3 bird knight with flying, double strike, and vigilance. This is only really playable in Cathrall decks, and because I recently built a Cathrall deck, I just wanted to mention this because if you guys have seen my deck take on that, it is really important that you get something with flying and double strike into your graveyard, and this adds another keyword from the cards that we've already gotten that have that. And so also, if this is a knight, if you care about knight tribal, and buffing up your knights, this could potentially be playable, but really I just wanted to mention this for Cathrall Aspect Warper. Next we have Whiskervale Forerunner. Holy crap, this has a tome of text. Okay, 4-mana 3/4 mouse bard. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, look at the top 5 cards of the library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them. You may put it onto the battlefield if it's your turn. If you don't put it on the battlefield, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Alright, so I think that this was pretty much made only for Maybell decks because we want to be targeting this potentially on each turn. It generates a lot of card advantage, and I think that you probably want to have this in some sort of equipment deck. Now, would this make the cut in a generic equipment deck? I'm doubtful about that, but if you care about the mouse creature type specifically, like Maybell might, that's where this card might become more playable. Just because it has a lot of text and is complicated, I probably wouldn't even run this just because I don't want to read this every time I play it. I seriously do have a bias against cards with a lot of text on them. But is it a great card advantage engine? Yes. I don't know if it's worth 4 mana. I think it's more playable at 3 mana if you were to look at sort of generic decks that want to be targeting their creatures. So I think you specifically have to care about the mouse creature type for this to be playable, which is why it might slot into Maybell decks. Next we have Jacked Rabbit, X and a colorless and a white, 1/2 Rabbit Warrior with Ravenous, which means this creature enters with X1 on counters on it. If X is 5 or more, draw a card when it enters. Whenever Jacked Rabbit attacks, create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to its power. So here we want to be buffing it up and creating rabbit tokens. I think you have to care specifically about the rabbit creature type in order for this to make the cut, just because we have to put energy into this. Although I will say that if you buff it, so like let's say that this were to be a 3-drop, you would make 2 rabbits when it attacks, and so in that way it's sort of like a Krenko style of effect. So I think in rabbit decks this is decent. Would it make the cut in like a generic tokens deck? I'm not particularly positive, although the modality of it is pretty tempting the more that I think about how the Ravenous can scale with this card. So definitely I think goes into rabbit decks. I'm on the fence about generic token decks just because if I were to cast like a 3-mana spell, I pretty much want those 3 bodies right away. In a Jetmir deck, I mean, it doesn't really matter because you get the buff as long as you have the tokens on the field. So that's interesting. I think it really is on the fence for like a generic token deck, and obviously it goes great in rabbit decks. Next we have Tempt with Bunnies, 3-mana sorcery with Tempting Offer. Draw a card and create a 1/1 rabbit creature token. Then each opponent may draw a card and create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. For each opponent who does, you draw a card and you create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. This has high variability because of the Tempting Offer. So I was initially thinking like, wow, this would go great in token decks because you're making tokens and drawing cards, right? That's exactly what you want to be doing, and so this is a slam dunk in a Jetmir. However, I think that specifically in a token deck, your opponents will not give you the extra cards and tokens because they know that you can make use of those more than they can. Because this is only really valuable if we're able to draw 3 cards. If we draw 4 cards, I mean, that's best case scenario. We're handing out a lot of resources, so there is that. But I think that in token decks, this is too scary for your opponents to actually take the offer. So what I actually think this could be useful in is some sort of like mono white control deck. So maybe like a Quain type of a deck where you're really looking to more for the card draw aspect than the token making aspect. And in control decks, you want to be drawing a lot of cards, generating a lot of card advantage to control the board. And this also would give you the incidental benefit of having blockers for chip damage. So I think that this actually fits into, obviously rabbit decks want this. Do mono white control decks want this? Maybe. I'm a little bit on the fence. I don't think that this goes into token decks either though, because just the fact that your opponents will be scared at you making use of those tokens and overrunning them with those. So Tempt with Bunnies is definitely on the fence, which is why it makes it into the honorable mentions. Next, we have Valley Questcaller, 2 mana, 2/3 Rabbit Warrior. Whenever one or more rabbits, bats, birds, and/or mice you control enter, scry 1. And it's a Lord effect for rabbits, bats, birds, and mice. So once again, you know, Kadir, Caller of the Small, eating well with this set. I think that this only really goes into rabbit decks because you want to care about the rabbit creature type specifically. I don't think it would make the cut into mice, bats, or birds decks because the +1/+1 is just not enough, I think, to be playable in Commander in 2024, so you definitely want to care about the rabbit creature type to trigger your synergies with rabbits. So specifically, I think maybe Kadir, Caller of the Small would want this. Next, we have Lupinflower Village, which is a land that can tap down a colorless. It enters untapped. You can add a white to cast a creature spell, and we can pay 2 and sack it. To look at the top 6 cards of the library, you may reveal a bat, bird, mouse, or rabbit creature card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So once again, it really just sort of fits into Kadir, Caller of the Small, or any white deck that cares specifically about these creature types. So maybe mouse decks would want this as well. I don't think that this would probably make the cut in a 3-color tribal deck. I just think that you want to be playing enough dual color lands to hit your colors in this specific scenario. So I would say tribal decks with either 2 colors or less where you can afford to just be making that 1 color of mana. And I believe with that, we move into my opinion for the top 3 white cards from this set. And here we go, my top 3, drum roll please. Season of the Burrow, Starfall Invocation, and Perch Protection, I think are the most interesting. Season of the Burrow, just a great another option for increasing devotion that is also modal. Starfall Invocation, I really think is probably the best card from the set. I just think that reanimation to trigger your ETB abilities, and also if you have any death triggers, Starfall Invocation can trigger all of that. And yeah, you gift out a card, but who cares? You can give that to the player who's behind the most. Perch Protection, I think, is the most interesting, though. I think it is the most interesting out of the set because we get a Deferious Protection for 6 mana, but we also gift an extra turn. And so I'm still not quite sure how that's sort of calculating out value-wise, and it is the one that I'm the most interested in playtesting. But I think the one that you'll probably see the most out of the set is Season of the Burrow, given how modal it is. And I personally will be playing a lot of Starfall Invocation because I think it is just a great option for board wipe. So with that was where we'll wrap up the video, guys. I will have the blue, red, green, and a black videos coming out in the next few days, so stay tuned for those. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it and subscribe for more content like this. I make it on the regular, and hopefully we'll see you all in the rest of the set reviews.